Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Thank you. Is the sound okay? Not on yet? There it is. I can hear it now. Here we go. Okay. This is my topic for this evening, Darwinian evolution or intelligent design. As you can see, some of the slides are going to be a little chopped off at the bottom. I actually prepared this for an IMAX theater, but by mistake, and this is the best we could do tonight. Okay, Darwinian evolution or intelligent design. Fact: many features of living things look as though they were intelligently designed. The question I'm going to be asking this evening is a fairly narrow one given the scope of this week's discussions, but it's actually going to turn out to be pretty broad. Is design in living things only an appearance, or are some features really designed? Darwinian evolution concludes the former, that design is only an appearance, and intelligent design theory, which I will be describing in a few minutes, concludes the latter, that design is real. Here's a quote from a prominent defender of Darwinian evolution, Richard Dawkins at Oxford, who actually defines biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. This is an acknowledgement of what I just said, that just about everybody agrees that living things look as though they were designed. But for Dawkins and for defenders of Darwinian evolution in general, the evidence of evolution reveals a world without design, without real design. In science, however, and Darwinian evolution, after all, is supposed to be science, theories are ultimately judged by how well they fit the evidence. So this evening, I'm going to take a look at some of the principal evidences that supposedly reveal a world without design. Before I start on it, though, I'd like to clarify what I mean in this talk by evolution. The word actually has many meanings. It can mean things change over time, history, the evolution of the United States political parties or something like that. In many contexts, it means simply the history of the cosmos. I'm not going to use such a broad meaning, however. This evening I'm going to speak specifically about biological evolution. In fact, biological evolution as described by Charles Darwin about 140 years ago. Darwin himself called his theory descent with modification. This indicates there are two aspects to the theory, the first being descent. And he wrote, "I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived a long time ago." The second aspect of his theory, the modification, Darwin attributed to natural selection, or survival of the fittest. And for Darwin, natural selection was the principal, although not the only, means whereby the original ancestor diversified into what we see around us today. Now, it's clear from Darwin's writings that he intended for this theory, or he understood this theory, to exclude design in any particular features of living things. For one thing, he said there's no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. And in perhaps his most succinct and clearest statement of his view, he said, or he wrote, "I am inclined to look at everything as resulting from designed laws." In other words, Darwin was willing to acknowledge that some deity might have designed the universe in the beginning. But for Darwin, once that happened, not only did the deity turn the world loose to operate by itself, but specific results of the biological evolutionary process for Darwin were not designed. That is, the outcome of the process was basically up to chance. So, although he didn't exclude design entirely, it's correct to say that for Darwin, no specific feature of any living thing can be regarded as design. Now, an aside here, to put this in context of some of the other talks that are going on this week. In the Christian tradition, of course, human beings are designed, created in the image of God. For an orthodox Darwinist, this is not the case. Human beings are the accidental byproduct of natural processes which did not have us in mind. That's actually a quote from Darwinian paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson. So there's a conflict here. I'm going to explore Darwin's theory at some length here and some of the major evidences for it to see whether Dawkins's claim that the evidence of evolution reveals a world without design can be upheld. This is the only diagram in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. By it, he intended to show how, if you can look down here at the bottom left, how a single species over time would split and diversify into many different forms. Now, if you look around you here in this room, you can see a lot of variety. Different body builds, skin color, hair color, aptitudes, whatever. This is the variability upon which, for Darwin, natural selection was supposed to work. And according to his theory, if we were to split this group here tonight into two groups and send one to the South Pole and the other to Jamaica, I'll go with the group to Jamaica, then after a few million years, these two groups will look very different from each other. And so for Darwin, this was the explanation of why we get not just different kinds of organisms within a single species, but why we get different species, different genera, different orders, classes, families, and so on, up the ladder, until we get after... Did I just hit something here? Oops. This is not my computer. I'm not used to this. Maybe if I just ignore it. Anyway, after many millions of generations, Darwin wrote, we would expect to find the very great differences that now distinguish, say, human beings from starfish or plants or bacteria. But this would happen only after many, many millions of years. Here we go. Now, this process certainly happens within a species. Okay, we could, if you've ever been around, this is an agricultural school, at least in part. Those of you who are studying agriculture know that it's possible to breed animals and plants so that they change in dramatic ways over many generations. But these are changes within a single species. This sort of descent with modification clearly happens. But it's equally clear that Darwin meant by his book much more than that. After all, he didn't call his book How Species Change Over Time. He called his book The Origin of Species, and he made it quite clear in his book that he intended to explain the entire diversity of all living things on the earth. So let's focus at a specific level in the biological hierarchy to see whether the evidence, as I said, it certainly supports changes within a species. Let's see if it supports, say, Darwin's claim that all animals are descended from a common ancestor. Three of the key lines of evidence that are used to support this claim in biology textbooks and in biological writings in general include fossils, molecules, and embryos, and I'll review each of these briefly in turn. Now remember, we're asking ourselves, are all animals descended from a common ancestor? First of all, we have to realize that there are many different basic kinds of animals. There's several dozen, in fact, depending on whose classification you accept. I've chosen here just 7 representative major groups. The technical name for them is phyla. Another word often used nowadays is body plan. One group is the flatworms, which includes the tapeworms, the roundworms, of which there are millions around the earth, echinoderms, which includes the starfish and sea urchins, chordates, which includes mammals, us, mollusks, which includes snails, clams, and octopuses, arthropods, which includes the crabs and insects, and annelids, which includes earthworms and leeches. These are basically very, very, very different kinds of animals because their bodies are constructed in radically different ways. And as I said, there's several dozen more. I'm just using these 7 as representative examples. Now, in Darwin's theory, if we had a decent fossil record, which we don't, and I'll get back to that in a minute, if we had a decent fossil record, we might expect to find something like this. Way back in the distant past, we have a single kind of animal. Gradually, over time, we get 2 major groups, and then maybe 4. Of course, it wouldn't be as neat as this, and so on, up until the present, where we have the several dozen major groups that we see around us now. When we actually look at the fossil record, what we find instead is this, a phenomenon called the Cambrian explosion, in which most of the major kinds of animals appear at about the same time in a geological instant, fully formed, with absolutely no fossil evidence that they shared a common ancestor. Now, there's 1 or 2 or 3 that appear slightly before that. There's some that appear later. But many, including 6 of the number 5 is in question, but 6 of the 7 certainly that I just mentioned appear simultaneously, geologically speaking, in the Cambrian explosion. So we have here theory and evidence, a striking conflict between the two. Darwin himself was aware of this. He wrote, "The manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the Cambrian, the geological period in which this happens, at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained." Now, Darwin thought the problem would be solved over subsequent decades of research. He hoped that the fossil record would be filled in, and if it didn't get filled in, he thought, well, then it's because the rocks have been deformed, or the fossils were too small to have left, or the animals were too small to have left fossils in the first place. But after 150 years of fossil collecting since the time of Darwin, it's now clear that, first of all, we have many animals we have many fossils from before the Cambrian. Many of the fossils that occur before the Cambrian are microfossils, that is, they can only be seen under a microscope. So the idea that they're too small to be found is just not true. The idea that animals were too delicate to fossilize before the Cambrian is also not true, because it turns out that most of the animals in the Cambrian explosion were soft-bodied. Anyway, that's just a summary of arguments used by people nowadays to maintain that the Cambrian explosion is real, that it does constitute a problem for Darwin's theory. Those who hold to Darwin's theory assume that it can still be explained away, but my point here is simply that the fossil evidence for the origin of animals does not fit Darwin's theory of evolution. The second level of evidence, used a lot nowadays, is evidence for molecules. Evolutionary biologists compare similarities among molecules in living organisms. Okay, we can't get molecules, with rare exceptions, from fossil organisms. So we take living organisms and we compare the molecules in them, and based on how similar those molecules are, we make inferences about how closely related these animals are and perhaps how long ago they diverged from a common ancestor. If we go back and look at the 7 representative groups I've chosen here, and we look at a particular molecule that all these animals have, it's called 18S RNA. It's a molecule used in transferring the code from DNA into protein. All animals have to use it, and so all these animals have it, but the molecule differs slightly from one animal to the next, so we can make these comparisons. And when we group these animals, these different groups of animals, according to the similarities in their 18S RNA, we get this grouping. The echinodates are most similar to chordates, arthropods and nematodes, and so on. And what an evolutionary biologist then does is use these comparisons to construct an evolutionary tree. Okay, these three are most similar, these two and these two. In fact, the similarity here is greater than the similarities here, so you see it's inferred that the common ancestor of these two is more recent. Okay, this is going into the past. It's important to remember here, though, that the only data we have are here. This is all inference. Now, it turns out that these five are more similar to each other than any of them is to these two, so we connect them down here, the idea being that they came from a common ancestor that was still apart from this lineage here, and then finally we work our way back to the hypothetical common ancestor of all of these groups. This is how molecules are used to reconstruct evolutionary lineages. But we run into some problems here. The first problem is when we do this based on 18S RNA and we compare it with the old-fashioned way of constructing these trees, which was based on body shape or anatomy or morphology, we get a conflict. This is the old tree based on anatomy. Here the flatworms and roundworms are together, and the insects and the earthworms. Over here, with 18S RNA, they're grouped differently. Okay, so maybe the molecules are more accurate than the morphology. But if we then look at a different molecule, not 18S RNA, but another one called 28S RNA, we get a different tree again. Okay, here the flatworms and the mollusks are together. Over here, it's the echinoderms and the mollusks. Okay, 18S and 28S. Two different molecules, we get two different results. What's cut off at the bottom of the screen here is the actual scientific reference for this, which I can give you later if you're interested. More striking even than that is that if we take the same molecule, 18S RNA, and we submit it to two different labs, we get two different results. So here's the same molecule in two different labs, giving us two strikingly different evolutionary trees. Now, does this refute Darwin's theory of evolution? No, I'm not claiming that it does. But it sure as heck doesn't provide evidence for it. The inconsistencies in these trees must be explained away to reconcile the data with common ancestry. They certainly don't provide evidence for common ancestry. Finally, on the issue of the common descent of all animals, embryos. Now, Darwin, we'll go back to these 7 representative phyla, but this time I'm just going to look at one of them, the phylum to which we belong, the chordates. Now, Darwin was aware of the problems with the fossil evidence, and he, of course, didn't know anything about the molecules. So for him, this was the most powerful evidence for his theory. He wrote, "The embryos of the most distinct species belonging to the same class are closely similar, but become, when fully developed, widely dissimilar." He called this by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of my theory. An illustration of what Darwin meant is provided here. It's still used in many biology textbooks. And what we have here on the far right are humans, then 3 other mammals, then birds, turtles, salamanders, and fish. This was done by a German Darwinist in the 1860s, Ernst Haeckel. And the point of the drawing is that when you go back in the early stages of these different animals, their embryos look almost identical. In fact, for Darwin, this gave us some indication of what the common ancestor of these animals actually looked like. The problem is, Haeckel, it turns out, faked his drawings. If we draw embryos from life, as they've been done here, Here's a human, a bird, a turtle, an amphibian, and a fish. The differences are striking. It's now acknowledged, widely acknowledged in fact, that Haeckel faked, fudged, doctored. I mean, you can use whatever word you want to depending on how hard you want to slam the guy for this. But the fact is, the pictures he drew don't look like the embryos, and Darwin himself was mistaken. But this isn't even the most serious problem with Haeckel's drawings. Okay, here's the stage that Haeckel misrepresented as the most similar. If you go back earlier in the development of the embryos, I don't know how clearly you can see it here, but the cell division patterns right from the get-go are radically different among these different classes. And the differences continue up until the time the cells begin to move to form this stage, which turns out to be the midpoint of embryo development in vertebrates. This is a quote from this is not a secret, by the way. This was a Dartmouth biologist 25 years ago who wrote, "It's only by semantic tricks and subjective selection of evidence, by bending the facts of nature, that one can argue that the earliest stages of vertebrate embryos are more similar than their adults. It's simply not true." Nowadays, developmental biologists have taken to using what they call the developmental hourglass to represent this. Here, the embryos are very different. They converge to a point where they're vaguely similar here, and this was the point that Haeckel misrepresented to make them look identical, and then they diverge again. This is not the pattern Darwin wanted. It's not the pattern that would provide the strongest single class of facts for his theory. The facts that he relied on, in fact, turned out not to be facts at all. So, to wrap up this section, question, are all animals descended from a common ancestor? Well, the evidence we've seen from fossils, molecules, and embryos is, to put it mildly, far from overwhelming. The second element in Darwin's theory is the mechanism of modification. Now, Darwin knew nothing about genes, as he knew nothing about the molecules. The modern version of Darwin's theory, called neo-Darwinism, adds genetic knowledge to his theory of natural selection, so that now the mechanism of evolution is supposed to be primarily natural selection or survival of the fittest, acting on random genetic mutations. And some of the major evidences used to support that in textbooks and elsewhere include Darwin's finches, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and four-winged fruit flies, which I'll discuss briefly in turn. First, Darwin's finches. Darwin himself had no evidence for natural selection. He freely admitted this. He used domestic selection, breeding, as an analogy for natural selection, and all he could do in his book was offer what he called one or two imaginary illustrations. Well, we now do have evidence for natural selection, real evidence. Some of the best, in my opinion, comes from Darwin's finches. Now, the name is kind of funny. Darwin's famous trip to the Galapagos. He just about totally ignored these birds. They were named Darwin's finches a century later as a sort of an honor to him, but they had almost nothing to do with the formulation of his theory. But that's an aside. In the 1970s, some Princeton biologists went to the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific here off the coast of Ecuador, and they courageously camped out on a little tiny island down here, Daphne Major, to study one species of ground finch, the medium ground finch. Now, it's important to note that these birds are very similar to each other. What did I just leave it alone, right? Then it goes away. There. These birds are very similar. The main difference, the most noticeable difference among them, is in the size and shape of their beaks, okay? So Peter and Rosemary Grant and their colleagues in the 70s went to study the medium ground finch, and as luck would have it, luck for them, not for the birds, they actually very carefully described every single bird on the island and kept a log. In 1977, a severe drought hit, killed about 85% of the medium ground finches on Daphne major by destroying the food supply. Those that survived had, on average, slightly larger beaks, which enabled them to crack the hard seeds that survived the drought. Okay, and then they reproduced, and their offspring had, on average, slightly larger beaks. This was natural selection in action. Well, the Grants and others extrapolated from this slight change and estimated that if there were a drought every 10 years or so, the beak would change enough over 200 years so that this would qualify as a new species of finch. Remember, the differences are mainly in the beaks. Problem is, within a year or two, the rains returned, the beaks went back to their previous value, and they've been oscillating back and forth about that value ever since. No net evolution occurred. In fact, chances are if the drought had continued or gotten worse, all of the birds would have died because the island would have become a desert. But that didn't happen because the rains came back. So there's no net evolution here. All we do see evidence of natural selection, but the small reversible effects occurred only within an existing species, just as we see in domestic selection. Minor reversible changes of this kind do not explain the origin of the medium ground finch, much less the origin of beaks, finches, or birds in the first place. All they show us are minor changes within existing species. Let's move to something perhaps a little more, that's had a little more time. We've done a little more research on it. Because of the generation time, bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes or so. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Oops, I went the wrong way. Yeah. Now, in this cartoon, these are bacterial cells, okay? There's no antibiotic present in this culture, but there is one cell which, let's assume, has resistance to a particular antibiotic. It may have acquired it through mutation or acquired it by getting a gene from another organism. Doesn't matter here. What matters is there's one resistant organism, and when we dose this colony with this antibiotic, the other organisms die. The only one that survives under proper conditions would be the resistant one, which then goes ahead and reproduces and makes more resistant organisms. This is a real pain in the neck for medical practice and hospitals especially, and it happens. Now, what happens if we remove the antibiotic? Well, the wild type or normal bacteria come back, and within a couple of generations, in most cases, they have restored the situation to normal because they're hardier, they're better adapted, generally speaking, than the resistant organism, and so they put things back to the way they were. Although the patient may be dead in the meantime, so it's still a serious problem for medical science. But what does it tell us about Darwinian evolution? Not much. It turns out that in 150 years of observing these phenomena, no bacteriologist has ever witnessed the origin of a new species, ever. Like observed cases of natural selection, like Darwin's finches, observed cases of beneficial mutations occur only within existing species. Now, I mentioned that the resistant bacteria might have gotten its resistance through a mutation. But I'm going to say more about mutations now. The mutation that helped that bacterium affected only a single molecule, a molecule involved in the antibiotic pathway. But for Darwinian evolution to happen, we need more than a minor biochemical change. We need a change in anatomy. We need changes that will explain the emergence of multicellular animals, of wings, of feathers, of lungs, and so on. This requires a lot more than changes in single molecules. And one example that's sometimes used to illustrate how this might happen is the four-winged fruit fly. Now, normal fruit flies have two wings. They also have little tiny appendages here behind the wings called balancers that they use to stabilize themselves when flying. But back in the 70s and 80s, a now Nobel Prize-winning geneticist found a way to combine 3 separate mutations to make a fly with 4 normal-looking wings. It turns out, however, that what happened is these balancers were transformed into the wings. Without the balancers, however, the fly cannot fly. Furthermore, the new wings, the extra pair, have no muscles, so they're absolutely useless. It's kind of like if you can imagine a Piper Cub or a small private plane trying to take off with an extra pair of wings strapped to its tail, dragging on the runway. These flies are very badly adapted. They have trouble flying and mating. In fact, they cannot survive outside the laboratory. So as evolutionary good news, they're not. It turns out that every example of a mutation we know of that significantly affects anatomy produces, like the 4-winged fruit fly, an organism that is less fit, not more fit. There is no evidence that I'm aware of, as a molecular biologist myself, that genetic mutations can provide the beneficial changes that we need in evolution. So, this is usually the cash value of all this, human evolution, because this is where we are affected ourselves. What about human evolution? This is adapted from a recent issue of Nature. It shows various fossils. Here's a chimp up here. This is a timeline in millions of years, human. Now, the only parameter in the horizontal axis here is brain size. We all know that there are a lot of things going on with animals besides brain size, but if we just look at brain size, we get something like this. The first odd thing about this, by the way, is that these fossils here, the Australopithecines, Lucy is right there, okay? They're generally thought of as our ancestors, but yet it sure looks to me like they're headed on the way to the chimps. But they're generally lumped into human ancestry, but that's an aside. Let's look at this relatively neat pattern of fossils here and ask what happened then in 2001. Well, another fossil was discovered that initially appeared to fit, at least in the general scheme, but it had such strange features that it really didn't fit the scheme at all, and an expert at the time wrote in Nature that because of that fossil, the evolutionary history of humans is now more complex and unresolved. It now looks set to be thrown into further confusion by the discovery of this new species. The following year, you may have heard about this one, Toomai, the famous Toomai fossil, which in some quarters was touted as the missing link, that finally explains human evolution. It turns out, first of all, it's not where it ought to be in this scheme. And second of all, again, it has features that it shouldn't have to be part of this story. Here's another expert writing in Nature. Toomai plays havoc with the tidy model of human origins, and his prediction was that it is just the tip of an iceberg of a very messy story. Well, this is nothing new. 20 years ago, 2 paleoanthropologists, 2 experts wrote, it's a myth that the evolutionary histories of living things are essentially a matter of discovering fossils. If it were true, we could expect that as more hominid fossils, human ancestral fossils, were found, the story of our evolution would become clearer, that if anything, the opposite has happened. So let's ignore all that, okay? Let's pretend none of that happened. The mess is not there. Let's pretend that what we really have is a nice, neat series, just for the sake of argument. We have all the intermediate forms we want. Whether they look like this or not doesn't matter for the sake of the argument. But we have all the intermediates we need, so this could plausibly, this looks more like that, this looks more like that, and so on and so forth, up the line. Let's assume that's what we've got. What does it show us? Well, in Darwinian evolution, we would argue then this evolved into that, this evolved into that, and so on and so forth by Darwinian descent with modification. A few years ago, 12 years ago now, an Ohio State biologist wrote a book called Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, obviously an effort to refute arguments against Darwinian evolution. And he explained that this, what I just showed you, is what paleoanthropologists or experts on human fossils do. And the evidence, he wrote, is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people. And to illustrate his point, he chose the Corvette. Now, these were not drawn, he used photos, but rather than try to get copyright permission, the illustrator of my book drew her own, and she actually did a better job. Turned out they had one of the models mislabeled, but that's another story too. Anyway, this was the evidence that he said cannot be denied by reasonable people. If you compare a 1953 and a 54 Corvette side by side, and then a 54 and a 55, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. Well, what's really overwhelmingly obvious here? These were all designed. This didn't evolve into that. If you put that in the junkyard and you walk away and come back in a million years, are you going to have that? Not a chance. So that's not what's going on here. What we have here is a series of designed entities. The fact that we can draw a nice, neat line, intermediates from here all the way to there, is absolutely irrelevant to whether what we're dealing with is descent with modification. Critics of Darwinian evolution have taken to calling this Berra's blunder, because, of course, Corvettes are designed, and the lesson from Berra's blunder is that if we really want a succession to show us something, we have to show that a natural mechanism could produce the succession. If we could show that wind and rust and rain could turn this into that, then we would have descent with modification in the Corvette. Similarly, if we could show natural processes that would change an ape-like creature into a human, then we could show descent with modification in animals, in living things. But as we've seen, as I've tried to persuade you anyway, the evidence for this is, as I've said, underwhelming at best. Oops. Since the evidence for Darwin's theory, as I've argued, is so weak, perhaps design, which was the other alternative with the Corvettes, is a reality rather than just an illusion. Remember, Dawkins said it was the evidence that shows us a world without design. Well, the evidence doesn't. I'm turning now briefly to intelligent design theory, and I'll give you a short outline of that, and then I'll conclude, because I really enjoy the question and answer session more than standing up here talking myself. Intelligent design theory, first of all, seeks to understand the logic of design inferences, and I'm going to amplify each of these points in just a minute. Second of all, it asks whether certain features of living things show evidence of design. And third, and this is the most daring and risky of all, it promises to make scientific research more fruitful. First, seeking to understand the logic of intelligent design. William Dembski, who, like me, is certifiably insane because he got 2 PhDs, wrote a book a few years ago called The Design Inference, in which he attempted to tease out the logic by which every single one of us makes design inferences. We do it, probably almost every day. We look at something and we try to determine in our mind, now, did that happen on purpose or is it an accident? Did that, is my car window broken and my stereo gone because of the wind or because somebody wanted my stereo? To pick a rather sad example, but design inferences happen all the time. Dembski analyzed the logic of it and concluded and argued in his book and has argued in several subsequent books that the design inference relies on two things, improbability and specification. And here's what he meant by that. If you know the game Scrabble, we have little wooden blocks with letters on them, and you try to make words out of them on the board. If you take a handful of Scrabble letters and you just drop them on the floor, they're going to make a very messy pile, maybe something like this. Now, this is highly improbable. If you don't believe me, try to drop another pile on the floor and make the same thing. This is exceedingly improbable. I don't know what the chances are, but chances are you're going to have to do several million more drops before you come up with anything even close to that. So none of us would call that designed. So the idea that design is merely a conclusion from improbability is simply not true. Look at this, though, a little bit off the bottom of the screen. These same letters arranged to spell an English sentence from Shakespeare. Methinks it is like a weasel. Same letters, maybe the same improbability, but in this case, we have also specification. The letters are lined up to fit a pattern independently of the blocks and the letters, a pattern that we have in English speech, in fact, in Shakespearean literature. So for Dembski, these are the two elements of a design inference, and it's when we have both of these that we make the design inference. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. He's not claiming that the inference is infallible, but it is a logical, legitimate inference, otherwise we couldn't live our lives, and this, he argues, is how we do it. He also argues that this inference can be extended to living things. Now for that, however, we need evidence. Another intelligent design theorist, a biochemist at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, Michael Behe, has written another book, Darwin's Black Box, in which he argues that certain features of living things, in fact, do show evidence of design. By Darwin's black box, by the way, Behe meant that for Darwin, many features of living things were just unknowns. Darwin didn't know about the molecular stuff, and so Behe, as a molecular biochemist, does, and he argues that now Darwin's theory is in much more trouble than it was 130 years ago. Quoting Darwin himself, Darwin said, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, his theory would collapse." Behe notes, as I noted a few minutes ago, natural selection selects only for functional advantage. If there's a functional disadvantage, it selects it out. If there's no advantage at all, it's invisible to natural selection. So we have to have a functional advantage. Behe defines an irreducibly complex system as one which functions only when all the parts are in place, and I'll show you one in just a minute. And he argues that one that can only function with everything in place cannot be built by slow, successive, slight modifications, because you don't have a function to be selected until all the pieces are already there. This is the heart of Behe's argument. An irreducibly complex biological system, if there is such a thing, he wrote, would be a powerful challenge to Darwinian evolution, and Behe claims to have found several that he describes in detail in his book. One of them, well, this computer doesn't have the software, sorry. I can't show you. It's a beautiful animation of a bacterial flagellum, so I'll have to talk you through it. I'll be the flagellum. Maybe you can view it on UCTV sometime. I don't know if you have that or not, Art, but anyway, bacteria have a little whip-like propeller, some bacteria. This whip-like propeller rotates at anywhere from 5 to 100,000 RPM. And that's what propels bacteria through the fluid that they're in. It's driven by a motor, and the motor itself is fueled by protons. And the motor, if you look at it in action, it looks just like a human machine. It has bushings and bearings and power generators and a universal joint. And it turns out that it has been studied in great detail by this man, among others. It turns out that some 30 or 40 parts are absolutely necessary for any functioning of the flagellum whatsoever. Take one of these away, and you don't have a flagellum. So this meets Behe's criterion of an irreducibly complex system, and he argues that this suggests the action of intelligent design because it has to be assembled with the end in sight, that is, by plan, by conscious plan, not piecemeal through survival of the fittest and random mutation. Finally, intelligent design theory promises to make scientific research more fruitful. Now this, as I said, is the riskiest proposition of all. I just came from a conference a few months ago down south of here that included a gathering of scientists who talked about how to implement intelligent design as a research program. The fruits of that remain to be seen, but I will, in retrospect, give you an example of how it might have worked 15 years ago. The fact is, a large proportion of our DNA does not code for protein. You know, DNA is supposed to make proteins, and the proteins are what run the body and give us our skin and our hair and eye color and all that. But a large proportion, perhaps 90% or so, does not code for protein. Perhaps you've heard the term junk DNA. According to neo-Darwinism, which said this 15 or 20 years ago, these non-coding regions are junk, just random noise that accumulated in the course of evolution. An intelligent design theorist back then, however, might have looked at it and said, now this is very implausible. Chances are that such a high proportion of our DNA would not be junk, but instead would serve some function, some purpose. Well, it turns out the latter is the case. We're now just beginning to discover, molecular biologists are beginning to discover, that junk DNA is not junk at all, but an essential part of our genome, our collection of genes. If intelligent design theory had been guiding DNA research 15 years ago, we might now be 15 years ahead in our understanding of this DNA, which we're now just beginning to analyze. Conclusions. I've argued here that the evidence for Darwinian evolution is much weaker than some of its backers would lead us to believe. Intelligent design theory is in the process of being worked out logically and supported empirically, and time will tell whether it's scientifically fruitful. I happen to think it will be. Finally, the evidence suggests that, remember our starting question, is design an illusion or is it real? The evidence actually suggests, contrary to Dawkins, that design in living things is real, not just an illusion. Now we have a problem, because design implies a designer. What are the implications of this? This is my last slide. Note in the things that I've said here, intelligent design theory claims only that there is evidence for design, and that, by implication, a designer. It does not get us to the God of Christianity. Intelligent design theory now, as a scientific research program, does not get us to the God of Christianity. It is not the same as natural theology. The God of Christianity is clearly more than a designer. For Christian faith, we rely not just on design, although we might rely on that partially, but we rely on things like scripture and religious experience, church doctrines, depending on your faith. Design is not the whole story. So I am not claiming here to have proven the existence of God. But intelligent design theory, if it's true, and I think it is, does open the door to God. And it's a door that Darwinian evolution so far has tried to keep closed. As Darwinist at Harvard, Richard Lewontin, once said, we accept Darwinian evolution not because of the evidence, but in spite of it, because we cannot afford to let a divine foot in the door. Well, I think we can, and I think intelligent design does just that. Thank you. That's it. Okay, everybody can go. Everyone agrees with me. No, it's time for Q&A. This is my favorite part, so feel free to say something, ask something. The organizers just request that you keep it short so as to give as many people as possible a chance to speak. But I'm done with my main presentation. He was up first, so you're up first.
Okay, my first question is, I guess it's kind of a two-part question, and you're talking about the Cambrian explosion, and you're saying, are you saying that all species originated in the Cambrian era? Is that what?
Question is, am I saying that all species originated in the Cambrian? No, I'm not. Clearly they didn't. What I'm saying is that most of the major groups of animals, the phyla, okay, each phylum has many species. But the strange thing about the Cambrian explosion is you would expect the major differences to appear gradually, and instead they appear suddenly. But the species have diversified very much since then. Second question.
The second question doesn't apply then.
Doesn't apply, okay. Yes, sir.
If Darwin said that basically any biological system that was irreducibly complex would break down his theory, wouldn't that mean that if there was one irreducibly complex system anywhere in biology, that would basically prove his theory wrong because he admitted it himself?
Okay, the question is, I'm repeating the question in case everyone didn't hear it. Since Darwin said an irreducibly complex system would refute his theory, doesn't the existence of just one example refute his theory? The problem is Darwin put a wiggle word in there. He said, could not possibly have arisen. And when you think about it, that's an impossible claim to meet. I think in science, we usually argue from plausibility and implausibility. I think the bacteria flagellum is highly implausible on Darwinian terms. Whether that means it could not possibly have arisen through Darwinian evolution would require further argumentation. And this is one area of disagreement right now between Michael Behe and his critics. Very, very heated discussion going on. Yes, sir.
If there are so much evidence against evolution and for a designer, why do the schools and colleges insist on only teaching evolution?
Ooh, you want to get me in trouble? Question is, if there's so much evidence against evolution, why do schools insist on teaching only evolution? There are lots of sociological and philosophical and psychological questions. I happen to think, first of all, you get different reasons from different people. Clearly, some people want Darwinism only taught because they have a very strong anti-religious agenda operating. I mean, I've had people tell me this, so I know it's true. I would not say that applies to everybody. I would say a lot of people, you know, most biologists, when I wrote my book, Icons of Evolution, 2.5 years ago, I talk about 10 icons, the embryos, the finches, human evolution. If you ask most biologists, what's the evidence for Darwinian evolution, they'll give you some of those icons, because that's all they know. That's what they studied in their introductory biology class, and that's all they've heard. They haven't heard anything since. So most biologists think the evidence for evolution is quite strong. And so they see no reason to teach alternatives. And all too often, the only alternative that seems available is Genesis literalism, okay, a literal interpretation of the 24-hour days in Genesis. I hope I've showed you tonight that that's not true. There are other alternatives to Darwinian evolution. I didn't talk about chronology at all. For me, the most important thing in a school, whether it's a high school or a college, is that students be taught the truth. If they're going to be, and I do think they should be taught Darwinian evolution. I absolutely think it should be taught, but I think the evidence should be taught truthfully. I do not think students should be shown faked pictures of embryos and told that this is evidence for Darwin's theory. There are other things that I didn't show you tonight that I could go into too. Second of all, I think students should be acquainted with the fact that there are serious disagreements here among scientists, not just between scientists and religious fundamentalists, but among scientists themselves. And finally, and I actually argued this, by the way, before the Ohio School Board last March, finally, I think teachers who want to teach criticisms of evolution and alternative viewpoints should be protected from censorship and reprisals. And unfortunately, in many cases, teachers have lost their jobs because they dared to stand up to the orthodoxy. Now, I could say a lot more. I say more in my book, but don't get me started.
All
Yes,
right. Well, one thing I was wondering about, you were talking about the fruit flies, the four-winged ones. Now, you said that it refutes evolution when you look at changing the balancers into wings, but assuming evolution existed, that could suggest that back then there were four-winged fruit flies and balancer fruit flies, and the four-winged ones were destroyed due to natural selection.
Excellent point. Okay, the questioner says, okay, so I argued that you couldn't get from the two-winged fruit fly to the four-winged fruit fly by Darwinian evolution, but maybe what actually happened was the reverse. You started out with a four-winged fly and it evolved into the two-winged fly. Very good point. But the evidence doesn't fit it. It turns out that the balancers are very intricate. They actually flutter like, I don't know what I'm not an aviator, so I don't know what you would compare it to in a human-made airplane, but they're highly complicated features that the fly needs. So they are actually more complicated than the second pair of wings. Okay, so the four-winged fruit fly did not just lose a pair of wings and become a two-winged fruit fly. If there was a four-winged fruit fly in the beginning, it had to evolve a very complicated system for those balancers, which again is a problem for Darwinian evolution. It's not merely the loss of a structure, it's the gain of a more complicated structure. And when you knock out the genes for the balancers, what the fly does is it says, well, I don't have any balancers, so I'll just pop another set of wings in there even though they're dead, okay? Anyway, I don't think it works either way, and I argue that in my book. Yes, sir?
I believe it's scientifically verified. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but they've discovered hybrids between Neanderthal man and Cro-Magnon man in Portugal.
Hybrid
between Neanderthal man and Cro-Magnon man in Portugal. I don't know when they discovered it, but I believe it's accepted. And just wondering how you can relate this to modern or human evolution, because if taking the creationist perspective, modern man would be God's creation, one species, whereas they're slowly uncovering evidence that modern man is a hybrid between many human hominids.
Okay.
Sorry.
Question is, has to do with a report that there's a fossil discovered that was a hybrid between.
Yeah, a fossil of I think I don't know how many fossils, but perhaps just one of. But I think there's many.
A hybrid between modern humans and Neanderthals.
Cro-Magnon, which supposedly came out of South Africa, as well as Neanderthal, which had evolved in Europe for like the last 200,000 years.
Okay.
It was a fossil. I think it was shorter legs, stockier legs, but I mean not necessarily that different than modern humans.
Okay, I haven't looked at that particular report, so I really can't comment with any sort of expertise. But if it's a fossil, the first thing I'd ask is how do they know it's a hybrid? Second thing I'd ask is, the story with Neanderthals is interesting. I mean, if you look at just the last 20 years or so, Neanderthals sort of go back and forth from being our ancestors, our cousins, totally unrelated to us. And if you just wait a couple of years, it sort of swings around. I mean, it's like the changes in the weather almost. Now, I don't know where it stands right now. I think right now they're thought to be unrelated to us by most experts. But I've heard experts say, if a Neanderthal were to climb on the bus with you, you wouldn't know it was a Neanderthal. It looked just like, a variety of a human being. I don't know. I don't know where it stands. So I just don't know. I do know this. I'm highly skeptical of stories spun by proponents of Darwinian evolution who want to convince us that all of this happened naturally. I've just become very skeptical, having looked at much of the evidence. Okay?
Well, yeah, one last question. Do you know, I can ask you this later, actually. I'll just do that. It's easy.
Okay, well, I'll be here. Yes, sir.
All right, I have two questions. In studying biochemistry here, I've read that in textbooks that human male DNA is more similar to chimpanzee male DNA than human female DNA. Is that true? And how do you explain that?
Say that again?
Human male DNA is closer to chimpanzee male DNA than human female DNA. Is that true? Or how do you explain that?
Something tells me I shouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. There's a very interesting book out written by an expert on this topic called "What Does It Mean to Be 98% Chimpanzee?" That's the title of the book. It's a very good book. And this guy's a Darwinist, okay? But he shows the, to put it mildly, the misleading nature of these claims purporting to show similarities among DNA. I take them all with a grain of salt. First of all, they're not comparing all the DNA. They're leaving out large portions of it. Second of all, the percentages are highly imaginative. They range anywhere from about 94 to 99, depending on who you read. So anyone who would try to make a comparison like that based on any of these percentages, I would question. But finally, and this may be the most radical thing I have to say tonight, the DNA is far less important than you think it is. This is the topic of my next book. DNA is a template for protein synthesis. It's a little bit like the pile of building materials for a house. If I gave each one of you in this room an identical pile of lumber, nails, roofing materials, pipes, wires, and so on, identical piles to 1,000 people, and said, build me a house, build me a structure, I would get 1,000 different structures. Because the building materials do not contain the blueprint for the house, and neither does the DNA contain your blueprint. Where it is, you have to read my next book. Maybe I'll have it figured out by then. And you have another one?
Yeah. How do you explain vestigial structures in
vestigial
chordata, like pharyngeal gill slits or tailbone?
Vestigial structures are those which supposedly have no function and are just holdovers from an evolutionary history. Tonsils were considered vestigial, appendices. It turns out, it's not a very strong argument because most vestigial structures, it turns out, are coming up with functions, which destroys their vestigial nature. Both the tonsils and the appendix are part of our immune system, it appears. The tailbone in a human embryo is a structural element. If you take it off, all the guts fall out. I mean, you need it to develop. So is that vestigial? I don't think it is. Now, there are other things like whale pelvises and so on, which there might be some vestigial organs. There might be. But in general, I would say the argument, it's sort of like vestige of the gaps argument at this point, because every time one comes up, it gets knocked down by the discovery of some function in the not too distant future. Yes, sir.
All right, I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one pertains to, in most science journals and stuff now, they have gradual evolution, which seems to be what you're referring to, and then they have also...
I can't hear you. Can you pull the microphone down, maybe? Okay.
And journals now, like I've been keeping up with it, they're proposing now that they also have, and it's also in my science class too, my biology class, that they have what they call gradual change, and there's the sudden bursts. Wouldn't that sort of explain the Cambrian thing?
Sudden burst?
Yes, exactly, where they have a just rapid, sudden change in animals, and it's actually been through the fossil record, they've sort of kind of inferred that. Just research recently too that has brought that up. Would that not, help explain sort of the Cambrian or Precambrian sudden growth of animals all at one point?
Okay, the question, as I understand it, is the ongoing disagreement among people in the Darwinian evolution camp between gradualism, that is slow incremental change over time, and sudden change, which goes by various names.
Oh no,
Is that it?
well, it's sort of, but they're also in my class. There's sort of, to me, it was implied that they've accepted both. In fact, that you'd have gradual change as well as you'd have sudden bursts of. I'm just saying, wouldn't that sort of
Right. Right. But the problem is, how do you explain the sudden changes? Nobody doubts that the sudden changes happen. I mean, the fossils show a sudden change in the Cambrian from no animals to almost all the different kinds, the different major kinds. How did that happen? Darwin's theory is really a gradualist theory, slight changes over many generations. If there is a mechanism of sudden change, if one could be shown, then that might explain these sudden changes, but so far none has been shown. Every now and then, every few years, the idea of a macromutation resurfaces. It's quite an old idea, but the idea that one single mutation could transform one organism into another kind of organism, there's no evidence for it. All the evidence is against it. And so, although sudden changes certainly happen, the mechanism is so far lacking.
Okay, and my second question is sort of combines two things. The asteroidal, isn't that not kind of coincidental that you would have a huge impact, and they actually have proof of this, that where there's a big crater that sort of wipes out all of Earth, and then, not necessarily Earth, but life on Earth, and then it would just reappear. And then the second thing is, in my geology class that I have right now, we don't really have good records of fossils dating really far back because the Earth is constantly changing and that things are being recycled essentially by going back into the mantle and then remelting and coming up. Wouldn't that help explain why there would not be a very good geological record the farther you get into the past?
So that you're asking about the crater extinction events?
Well, how it would just kind of, in one sense, it would support that why there would have a sudden burst of life, in other words, that would fill out.
And the other is the poor fossil record.
And pertaining to geology and how it would recycle the material, and that wouldn't be that much fossil record left the farther back you go due to the erosion and recycling of material.
Right. There certainly have been mass extinctions in the history of life, at least if we're to trust the fossil record, which I do. Now, if you wipe out everything, or a lot of things, the ground is clear for new things to evolve. And they do appear, according to the fossil record. New things appear. Mammals take over the Earth in place of the dinosaurs. The question is how? My main question to Darwinian evolution is, what's the mechanism? Without the mechanism, you meaning Darwin, have not ruled out design. In fact, design seems to me to be a very viable option here, that new creatures were added by design on purpose. So I ask, where's the mechanism? So far, we don't even have a clue how this could happen. Just because things are wiped out, if you burn your house down, does that mean new houses are going to spring up in its place? Of course not. Someone has to build them. I would say the same thing about living things. About the poor fossil record, I skipped over this in a hurry in my presentation, but I did mention that, of course, the fossil record gets poorer the further back we go, but it's thought by many fossil experts now to be good enough to show us that the Cambrian explosion, for one thing, is real. The fossil record will never be perfect, of course, but we do have many fossils before the Cambrian. They're not fossils of animals. They're small, they're delicate, they're hard to find, but they're there by the millions. But they're not animals. Then all of a sudden we get animals. And that's what the record shows. Now, we could say, well, still, it's a problem because of the poor record. Okay, but then the bottom line here is still, we do not have fossil evidence for the Darwinian evolution of the major kinds of animals. The evidence just isn't there, or the evidence we have is against the theory. Either way, it's not good for the theory. Okay? Yes, sir.
Wouldn't that explain it, though?
I need to.
I know you need to move on, but I'm just saying, wouldn't that?
One question.
Yeah, that was already 3 questions. Let me get to the next person. We can talk afterwards.
All right,
Come on up
thank you.
afterwards.
During your presentation, you quoted Darwin a lot directly.
Quoted?
You quoted Darwin himself a lot.
Yes.
And a lot of his arguments. But since he was the one, just because he was the one who founded the theory, since it was so long ago and there was a lot that he wasn't aware of, weren't you setting up a little bit of a straw man argument against Darwinism by using its founders' arguments that were from so long ago?
Okay, good question. Am I, by using Darwin himself as a foil, am I erecting a straw man? I could, in other presentations I've given, I could quote and have quoted from modern Darwinists saying exactly the same things Darwin said. The issues that he raises are still with us. In fact, writing in evolutionary biology, one way you make your points, in many articles at least, is to say this is what Darwin thought, and that lends credence to your point. Now, another way to make points is to say Darwin was completely wrong and I have a radical new idea, which is what Stephen Jay Gould did with punctuated equilibrium, made him famous. But a lot of people, I would say a majority of evolutionary biologists, still look to Darwin for their major framework, their conceptual framework. I know you're over there, but these folks have been waiting longer, so let me get a few of them and then I'll get you. Yes, sir.
You discussed improbability with the examples of the Scrabble pieces falling on the ground.
Scrabble pieces.
And however, Immanuel Kant saw that a static, infinitely old, and infinitely large universe would allow the possibility of an infinite number of random chances. Where is the demise in his argument? Where is the demise in his argument? Where is he fault?
Kant?
Yeah.
And the argument being if you give it enough time,
Right.
you'll get improbable things to happen.
Right.
Well, I think given enough time, you'll get lots of improbable things to happen. Dembski actually, as a mathematician, Bill Dembski, whom I cited here, sets an upper probability bound, and he arrives at it by adding up the number of seconds in the history of the cosmos that we think were there, and the number of particles, and which gives you, if you're into computational analysis, some idea of how many computational acts could have occurred since the Big Bang. And he comes up with a 10 to the 150th as an upper bound. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I don't know how valid that is, but he tries to work within that. I'm much more, I work with messy, frog eggs and stuff like that, so I don't deal with math so much. But I do know this, without the mechanism, you're nowhere. I can let my 12-year-old son mess up his room, and I can give it 1,000,000 years, and it's not going to clean itself up again till I go in and do it, or make him do it. You got to have the mechanism. Without the mechanism, I don't care how much time you have. You can let the Corvette sit in the junkyard as long as you want, and it will just rust. Actually, somebody pointed out to me Corvettes were made of fiberglass, but let's make it a Ford, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, one more, and then I'll move over here. Yes, sir.
I guess it seems like most of the evidence that you've used has been like studies that have been done in labs and things like that, maybe even long ones, 10, 12 years, something like that. How can you say that any study that's been done in a lab for such a small time frame be equal to anything that happened over 4 billion years?
The question is, how can I extrapolate from a dozen years of lab work to 4 billion years? Well, I hope I'm not doing that. What I'm asking for is some hint of a mechanism that can do the job that has to be done. Give me the mechanism, and if it's extrapolatable, then it's reasonable, I think. If I walk from here to Santa Maria, and it takes me X number of hours, and then I say, well, give me 10 years, and I can walk from here to Tierra del Fuego. Okay, now that's extrapolatable, because the same process can get me from one to the other, presumably. But if I say I walk from here to Santa Maria in X number of hours, give me 1,000,000 years and I'll make it to the moon, we're talking about apples and oranges. And I think Darwinists often do that. They talk about changes within existing species that are well understood and extrapolate those to the origin of wings and lungs and eyes and things like that, about which we don't know anything. We don't know anything about the process that makes those features. So until we do, I think, I'm not saying the theory is refuted. I think in some respects it might be. What I am saying is, well, it's still a theory at best. I would like to see more evidence. Yes, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Reverend Bollinger, who was a prominent biblical scholar in the late 1800s, made a statement that God's word must not need agree with science, but science agree with God's word. As far as you know, is there any scientific evidence that contradicts biblical scripture of God being the creator of heaven and earth, who created plants after their kind, animals after their kind, birds after their kind, sea creatures after their kind, and man?
Do I know of any evidence that contradicts scriptural claims that God created these creatures after their own kind? No, I don't. But obviously, the things you just cited are, some of them at least, rather vague. Sea creatures. There are lots of different kinds of sea creatures. So science at least tries to become more specific. I still think it's true that things reproduce after their own kind. But what is kind? That gets a little messy. And it's our job, I think, as scientists to try to clarify that. But I haven't seen anything that refutes the idea that God created creatures to reproduce after their own kind. It's just that it's rather vague as it stands.
Is the word genus more clear than the word kind?
I would say, if you're trying to say that genus, not species, but genus as opposed to family or something like that, I would have to take it on a case-by-case basis and look at the evidence.
Okay.
Remember, too, species, genus, and so on are sometimes human labels put on things. So we have to be careful that we're not, just fulfilling our own prophecies here. Things can happen in plants, for example, that do not happen in animals in terms of the origin of new species. So I would say take it on a case-by-case basis. As a scientist, that's what I would do.
But as a scientist, you haven't found anything that contradicts that?
God's creatorship? No.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Truth. Veritas.
Truth. Okay.
Truth is merely the art of persuasion.
Truth is merely the art of persuasion.
With confidence. You were very confident today in refuting Darwin's evidence. If the evidence does not support Darwinism, what evidence is there to support creationism so that I can be persuaded?
What do you mean by creationism? Unfortunately, like evolution, it has many meanings, so it's hard to pin down. Which meaning are you using?
I would say strictly from the biblical sense of that God created one man, Adam, and from Adam sprung Eve.
So the sense of creation that you're using is that God created Adam.
Genesis.
And from Adam created Eve.
Yes.
And you want to know what evidence is there for that?
How can I be persuaded?
Come talk to me afterwards. By the way, I do not think truth is the art of persuasion. I think truth, some things are true and some are not. It's true, for example, if I drop this, it's going to fall to the floor. Boom. That's truth. If you doubt it, try jumping off the roof. No, don't really do that. I'm not mocking you, but I'm saying that there are objective truths in the real world that are not an artifact of persuasiveness. They really are true, regardless of what we say about them. You were probably here before he was.
No, they were sitting over
there.
No?
Okay, sorry. Okay, okay.
You mentioned Gould, and I'm curious what your...
Mentioned?
Gould.
Stephen Jay Gould?
Right, Stephen Jay Gould. Your thoughts on, his panda's thumb as well as the thoughts on the orchids. That these things are kind of jury-rigged, I believe are his words. And why would God or whatever this being is that created things, why would he make this thumb sort of like apparatus, which is used for scraping bamboo, out of just random pieces that were there already, and they're present in everything. Just happened to be in pandems that they formed this little V-notch. And the same thing with orchids.
Orchids?
Darwin used orchids. He studied orchids, and like the petals, random petals, would in different orchids serve different purposes. Some of them create trapdoors so that they get stuck in, and they have to actually kind of work their way through. It creates it makes the insects, when they land on them, it'll actually kind of open a little bit, and then they go in to where all the nectar and stuff is. They're forced to go past where the pollen would be, and there's only one way they can go out is through there. And these are all developed out of things that are already in existence. Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, the question, to summarize it, I hope I can summarize it adequately, is what about things that appear to be sort of jury-rigged out of pre-existing stuff?
Pre-existing stuff.
Well, I'll say several things. First of all, intelligent design theory does not claim that everything is designed. Interestingly enough, if only one thing in some living thing somewhere is designed, Darwinism is in big trouble. But intelligent design theory is not threatened by the idea that some things do happen accidentally. It's not a problem. Second of all, many things that are claimed to be jury-rigged and sort of haphazard, and the word is actually suboptimal, less than the best, don't stand up to scrutiny. The panda's thumb is actually pretty darn good. Have you ever tried to strip bamboo?
No, I haven't.
No, it's really, I would let a panda do it, you know. So I don't know that that's just haphazard. You know, I think it's pretty well designed for stripping bamboo. But finally, making things out of pre-existing stuff, there's nothing inherently anti-design about that. I mean, my son does it all the time. You know, he takes pieces from remote control cars and this and that and puts them together, and he made a wheelchair, a little remote control wheelchair that ran around the table just for fun. So that's still design. So sure, some things may not be designed, but I think a lot more is designed than proponents of Darwinian evolution are willing to admit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Let's stop with this question after yours. Okay.
Sure. One of your conclusions is that this design theory opens the doors to Christian faith.
Yes.
Why Christian faith? Why not Hinduism? Why not Buddhism? All these other religions that you've studied.
Aye, there's the rub. Once you admit the reality of design, the door is open. How do you get to the Christian faith instead of to some other faith? Well, as I mentioned briefly, you get there with the Bible, with spiritual experiences, prayer. People have different routes of getting there. I'm not saying all religions are equal. I don't believe that myself. But the mere fact of design is not the whole answer. That's all I'm saying. It opens the door. It breaks the hold of atheism that currently has our public school system in its grip. It breaks that hold. It opens the door. It liberates. But, you know, liberation is not the whole story. What you do with your freedom is another matter entirely. And that's where the other work of Christian evangelists or whatever comes into play. And last question, sir.
Thank you. I just want to thank you for coming out here tonight. It's awesome. Could you please clarify whether the presentation you gave tonight was using the evidence against Darwinian evolution as evidence in support of intelligent design? And if that's not the case, what type of evidence is on the forefront? You said that they're trying to logically nail down the theory. What type of evidence is up and coming, or that you have in mind for the intelligent design?
Okay, the question is, was I giving evidence against Darwinism or for design? Well, a lot of what I said was just evidence against Darwinism to show that the Darwinian claim to have excluded design is false. Darwinism does not exclude design on the basis of evidence. And I didn't get into this in depth, but it does it on the basis of philosophy. There was a philosophical turn 150 years ago, not an empirical one. So I was giving evidence to show that, in fact, Darwinism is not good empirical science, Darwinism in its grandest claims. But that doesn't prove that intelligent design is true. All it does is prove that it's a possibility, because the exclusion of design is false, I would argue. Okay, so intelligent design is a possibility. What's the positive evidence for design? I mentioned Dembski and Behe. There are others as well, but they are trying to formulate the evidence and the argument rigorously enough to persuade an objective person whether something is designed or not. And part of the problem is they have to be able to distinguish between something that's designed and something that's not designed. Personally, and this will be my last statement, I think the real test for design will be whether it can fruitfully guide scientific research. As a scientist myself, I believe that that's the case, but at this point, it's a belief, it's a faith. I freely admit it. I think we can do it, but time will tell whether we actually can. When I leave here, I'm stopping off in the Bay Area to set up some collaborative experiments, not to prove design, but to use the framework of design theory to actually produce valuable scientific results. I think we can do it, but stay tuned and we'll find out. Okay, thank you all very much. Now don't go. You want to?
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.